Hello and welcome to What's the Dumbest Thing? So, I'm your host, Mike Hainsworth. Hello. And today we have our guest with us, which is Nick Jackson, or Nicholas, I guess, if it depends if you're in trouble or not. Welcome, Nick.
Nick's fine, thank you.
Cool. So, this podcast is all about some of the dumbest things that we've seen within a cybersecurity context, some of the things that we think that are the bare minimum that any organisation should be undertaking, and best of all, the questions that you have asked. And for those of you that are listening, I'm actually pointing at the camera and the microphone right now. So, Nick, you might want to fill in some of the gaps as I go through the introduction or at the end of it. But you've got a pretty great track record because you've been in cybersecurity now in the sphere since 2012. You worked at PwC,
Yep.
You worked at NCC. I know you also do or have done some mentorship for students that are looking to come into the sector. And then most recently, although we're talking about a few years now, you've been Global Director of Cybersecurity Services at a company whose name we're not going to mention because we want to maintain our vendor neutrality. But if anyone's to go and look at your LinkedIn profile, they'll probably see the words Defender and Bit within context somewhere there. But you're currently heading their team that does the offensive and advisory security of the consultancy, which ultimately help end users with their internal security. Not sure. Have I missed anything there with the intro? Or was that
Yeah, I mean, you have not missed anything. My responsibility is basically the consulting practice. So, as you said, the offensive and advisory services, we do help end users, but it's also the organizations more broadly. So it could be anything from writing and defining a 5-year cybersecurity strategy, looking at policy documentations all the way through to kind of a risk assessment or kind of tabletop exercises to prepare for an incident. And then on the flip side, on the offensive, we've got the kind of red teaming, pen testing, phishing simulations, all the good stuff that you'd expect at the majority of consulting practices.
Cool. Good. Well, just before we get really stuck in, I just want to offer a little bit of housekeeping for those of you that are viewing and listening. Just put your feet up, settle down, get yourself a cup of coffee, put your phone on silent, and ignore all of those emails. Because and during the show, if you find yourself that you're enjoying what we're saying, then please hit the like. And better still, the subscribe button, and then you'll know when the next episodes are coming up. Or if you want to comment or have a question, then just drop that in the comments. I'm sure there'll be lots of little buttons pinging up all over the screen when we come to view right now. So great. So let's kick off, Nick. First question: what's the dumbest thing you've seen within the cybersecurity environment? And to be fair, just to qualify that just slightly, we might see things that are accidental or deliberate. But regardless of whether they are or they're not, they might appear to an outside pair of eyes as odd, and therefore they'd think, why? So what's the dumbest thing?
I mean, I think we briefly spoke about this, and I think the majority of our listeners today have probably seen or heard of situations where people have a post-it note stuck to the screen with a password. I've seen, obviously, those. I've seen some slightly what they would deem to be more sophisticated, where they have an entire notes folder or an Outlook contacts list where the username and passwords for each, say for example there's a Netflix account, they would have a contact called Netflix and then the relevant password under the contact, which I think majority of people have either heard of or seen directly. I think the biggest thing that I've seen that was, in my opinion, stupidity at its peak, but in an area where I wouldn't expect it, was I was working in a foreign country for a major utility provider that essentially provided water to the entire island. We found some firewall rules basically that had what we call a kind of open, so an any ending. So although they had a series of rule sets, because it didn't have a kind of deny element to it at the end, essentially the entire firewall was open. As you can imagine, that raised some serious alarm bells when we raised it. The person who was responsible, who was meant to be going on a stag on the Friday, quickly wasn't able to attend at the scheduled timing and had to make some serious changes. But if you can laugh at that high level piece, but if you think about the risk that's associated with that, that's shutting down. If someone was to remotely access that, that's shutting down water supplies, that's manipulating water supplies. So there's potentially even a threat to life. very stupid mistake, stupid, error, very basic error, given that the rule set was actually quite substantial apart from the very ending. But yeah, it could cause some serious risk.
And that's an interesting one, because obviously, I mean, we've touched on this on other casts, episodes, that referencing the hack that happened with the infrastructure in the US during the most recent elections, and that was the telecoms infrastructure, and that was because of the essentially old kit having old weaknesses which were exploited because they hadn't been updated or whatever, and you can understand why people want to sweat the asset, but if you're going to sweat an asset, then you're going to have to make sure that it's up to date with as much of the security as possible. And if it's not, then you get rid of it, which is obviously different to what you just.
No, it's important though. I mean, I actually was at a conference Monday and Tuesday. I just saw a notification pop up. Someone's posted something. But I did a presentation on pretty much exactly that. Not necessarily legacy systems, but definitely patching systems. Because if we go back to a Verizon report in 2023, they spoke about honeypots seeing basically first signs of activity within 5 days of a vulnerability being disclosed. However, we now are seeing it being more closer to the 24-hour mark or below. And so organizations that have systems that have vulnerabilities that need to be patched, and there is a known patch, I definitely would stress the need to get that kind of done as soon as possible.
Going down from 5 days to 24 hours, that's pretty impressive, really.
Yeah. It's going to be one that are going to be very difficult for companies to overcome and actually reach, because you're going to need to test a patch. You can't just push it through. It's just not going to be possible. But I think it just shows and stresses the importance of timeliness.
Just from the point of view of for people that might be listening that are more owner or decision maker orientated, that aren't necessarily literate. I shouldn't say that, but you know what I mean. It's kind of like there's terminology and jargon that you hear every day that you kind of become comfortable and familiar with, but if you don't hear it every day, it's easy. Honeypot. How would you define that? I mean, because I remember when. What was his name? I can't remember the name of the politician, but he was kind of attracted by a couple of young ladies, and they asked him to do something, and he said he could do it, and it kind of ruined his career, sort of thing. But and they were, in that context, that's a very physical thing with people. But how would you scope that or explain that to somebody who doesn't necessarily understand it in a cybersecurity context?
So the easiest way to explain a honeypot is essentially a dummy server, a dummy device somewhere that's essentially trying to attract the negative actors or the threat actors specifically to catch them before they catch or gain access to the stuff that you would actually deem to be crown jewels. So imagine it being like a mouse trap or a rat trap. It's that kind of thing where you're trying to, instead of them getting the stuff you want to basically protect, you put something else in place to kind of catch them beforehand. The idea is that alerts are raised and you can take action before then the critical or crown jewels have been touched or manipulated. In terms of the wider point I was making, again, just for anyone that doesn't know, when we say patches, we mean an update. If you think of your iPhone and when, Apple released iOS 18.0011, whatever the numbers may be, essentially when you see those come through, as much as if you were to update it, there may be a slight bug in the technology and the software, and you may get annoyed that maybe something isn't working as it should, I would probably still recommend any of those types of updates or patches, as we call them in the industry, to do them as soon as possible, because they are answering and closing down known vulnerabilities that hackers and threat actors do know about, and it would definitely benefit you to do that. But it's simply a patch is an update to a piece of software where someone's made a cosmetic update. It could be branding, IP, visuals, colors, all the way through to a significant update, which could involve more features, adding additional services to the software itself.
Yeah, that's another important one, really, because we've had it. So we were talking again on another episode, and that was one of the main points with the discussion, was the fact that if you don't do a patch, I mean, patches or not keeping up to date with them is one of the classic holes in which you can get into a network from a cybersecurity, from a pen testing point of view. Because once the patch update has been put out there, then everybody who's a malicious or bad actor will sit there and go, well, okay, fine, I just got to find one of them that's already not unpatched, that haven't updated the firmware or whatever it is, and then they're able to find a way in. So it is really, really important that one does update one's software as soon as.
Yeah, no, 100%. As I was saying before, and again, as I mentioned it yesterday, any vulnerability that's identified, hackers, they'll look for three things. One, a kind of high, what we call CVSS score, which is basically a vulnerability score to show that it's basically very bad.
Mm-hmm.
One other one is that it impacts a high number of systems, and another one is I'll think of it after. But essentially, if those three high level requirements are matched, the idea is that some of the threat actors will then create custom scanners to find any device with that vulnerability. So, to your point about making sure that you run the patch and you deploy it as soon as possible, it's very, very, very necessary. We're seeing more threat actors target known vulnerabilities than specifically companies themselves. Instead of targeting Amazon.com because you have a vendetta against them, you're looking for a known vulnerability in an exposed edge device, so a network connected, publicly accessible device, rather than targeting a company, and you then try and basically gather value from a number of different things, data exfiltration, regardless of the company. You're not targeting a specific entity itself.
That's interesting as well, because that ties in with another point that was made or asked of us was, well, I'm just a one-man band, or I'm a small company, or we've only got 10, 20, 30 staff. Kind of, what does it matter?
Yeah.
It does, because we're not talking, although there are very, very targeted attacks, a lot of what's going on at the moment is just kind of spray and pray, and it's like throw whatever's at the wall and see what sticks. So it doesn't really matter if you're a small entity or a large entity. It's gonna hit you at some point, and that's why it is important for even the small entities to pay attention to this.
Yeah. Arguably, it's more important. Again, we had a conversation yesterday thinking about suppliers and supply chain in general. If you're looking at the big oligopolists, the big organizations that you would assume have really good security in place, have SOC 2, ISO 27001, and don't allow you to assess them in any way, shape, or form, versus a small IT provider that has 30 staff, you'd assume that the smaller company is more susceptible. They have less, you would say they are less risky because they're not integral to you, but they are more susceptible and therefore probably pose more risk to you and should have more attention. And in reality, as I said, because threat actors don't care who they target, they're just trying to monetize on anything. Every organization has something to gain. There is some information you can steal, you can put it on the dark web, you can sell it, you can monetize it, you can provide access. Again, anyone who doesn't know, who's maybe listening, there's something called cryptojacking. People basically hack into your network, your organization, and use your compute power to basically mine for crypto. Again, all of these organizations think of that as a kind of low effort monetization route. So there's loads of things people can do for a smaller organization where the risk may deem to be smaller, but in theory, it's probably a higher risk.
I don't know if you remember this, but back in the 90s, there was this whole kind of the SETI project, and it was basically that they were getting all this information from satellite stuff that NASA was pooling all of this data, and it didn't have enough computing power, so it kind of opened it out so that if you wanted to sign on, you could, whilst you go off to lunch, you can let your computer download and analyze to see if there's to see if you can be the one that finds evidence of life outside of our planet, right? But I mean, I remember us being, but it's the same thing, right? But in an illegal context.
Yeah. I mean, Amazon had a big problem at the very beginning when they started, AWS essentially, because that's what a lot of organizations were having threat actors hack into their network, essentially buy more compute, because the whole point of the cloud is it's scalable. So somebody can break into your network, essentially purchase way more, space and server power than you need, and then use it for cryptojacking. So it's becoming less popular, but it's still a method.
A thing, and I tell you what. So some of the customers have got so much kind of stuff going on within Amazon and AWS and any of the kind of the cloud providers actually, that it's really easy to spin up a machine. And if you're not actually watching it, it's a little bit like I don't know, gym membership.
Yeah,
you're not paying attention. You're paying for it, and you're not using it, and that's really, really easy. So I mean, it's a lot easier for that to happen and people to exploit that kind of. That's almost like that's a mental vulnerability more than anything else. Anyway, Cool. Oh, look, so we've actually gone off on quite a couple of nice little rabbit holes there. So look, just a little bit more, just to repeat the housekeeping, but again, subscribe, comment, like, all the little buttons will pop up, and again, it's importantly the questions that you have, or if you want to sit where Nick's sitting right now, then do let us know. So another thing I forgot to mention is that if you've been enjoying what we've been speaking about today so far, then perhaps having a read of the newsletter that we put up, that would be great. We hope that the newsletter is more than just a cure for insomnia, but it will actually cover a bunch of different topics within the whole spectrum that we talk about. So second question then, Nick, any organisation, what would you say are the bare minimum elements of their cybersecurity that they should put in place? And, previous episodes, we've spoken about securing passwords, multi-factor authentication, having a standalone admin account so it's not your daily drive. Then also, we've dealt with customers from sizes as few as 5 to thousands of users. So granted that gives us quite a wide scope. Is there something that you would say that everybody could put into place, or would you suggest different things for different sizes?
I would definitely say it's different for different organizations, different sizes, the complexity that they have, the sectors that they fall into. But I think all the things you mentioned before, the kind of basic cybersecurity hygiene, as you mentioned, passwords, MFA, admin accounts, kind of general kind of access management, privilege, at least privilege and things like that, I think I would definitely say are kind of foundational. However, one other thing that maybe you didn't mention, which I think probably more so on the larger side, but the smaller organization should still be considering it, is more on the instant response side. And I'm not saying to have a full instant response, organization or service ready to go, but I think it's more prepare yourself for that event. There's a high likelihood that will happen, and just have even if you're a very small company with 2, 3, 4, 5 individuals, and you don't have instant response policies and processes and playbooks, and you don't have a third party on retainer for forensic support and things like that, make sure that you know what you need to do. If something was to happen tomorrow, do you know who your IT service provider is if it's not managed internally? Do you know, are there any key stakeholders or any key suppliers that you work with? Do you know if, for example, if data protection was to be impacted and you needed to notify the ICO, who's the DPO? Do you have the relevant things in place? Are there shareholders? Are there other, VCs, private equity firms that, you connect with in some way that you have to notify? Because again, there'll be an impact. So it's just making sure you're prepared. I think too many organizations only consider the more proactive steps and the kind of defensive steps, which, don't get me wrong, are key. But I think nowadays it's very much a case of when, not if. And if you are going to more than likely have something happen to you, it's better to be prepared ahead of time, know who to talk to, know who is responsible for what, and what steps need to be taken, so that in the event that was to happen, and when it does happen, unfortunately, that you're not scrambling around, because that is the worst time to be scrambling around, because your head's going to be all over the place. Obviously, for more mature organizations, if things like ransomware are a concern and things like that, there's a lot more kind of process orientated steps you can take to kind of make yourself feel prepared. Should we pay it? Do we pay it? Does our insurance provider pay it? For example, if the ransom is of a certain value, who's got the authority to pay it? If we have to spend a lot of money on forensics or instant response capability, what's the highest threshold the CISO or head of security can actually approve before having to go through a full procurement process? Because again, time is of the essence. You may need to kind of circumvent certain processes internally. So there's a number of different things depending on the size of the organization. But I would definitely say, maybe not all of those things, but just at least have a conversation at a minimum internally to say, the IT service provider I use, do they even, what is their role? Do I know where their role starts, where their role finishes, where my role starts, my role finishes, just to make sure that there is some coordination? That would be my suggestion.
That's really interesting, because we did talk about this in another episode in context of a business continuity plan.
Yeah.
Same difference.
Yeah.
But and then I think the other thing then is that you kind of touched on it there, was also my understanding of DORA, which is the Europeans have decided to put another bit of regulation into play.
Yeah.
But this is,
why not?
Yeah, exactly. It's not like they've got anything better to do. But anyway, that's focused on anybody that's operating in the financial services. And my understanding of it, which is limited, but it's to do with supply chain management, or at least a component of it looks at your supply chain. So if you're a financial player, for a bank, for instance, and you've got somebody who's providing you with some form of IT element, then DORA requires them to look at you and go, well, how will you cope with? And so it is, which is an important thing, is
Yeah.
looking more and more now, we're going to have to start looking at our supply chain and start asking those questions, which are really important.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, DORA specifically focuses on operational resilience in the financial sector. As you said, the financial sector is quite broad. It covers everything from kind of small fintechs to large banks. And the supplier aspect is essentially DORA in Europe, and we're fully expecting it to be adopted in some way, shape, or form locally in the UK. But what we're seeing is that the DORA regulation, and whatever the UK will call our equivalent, is essentially pushing the responsibility on and the accountability on the organisation, but they're giving the local regulators, like the FCA in the UK, essentially the responsibility to look over and look for systemic risks across critical suppliers in the various regions they're responsible for. So as an example, if there is 3 large IT service providers in the UK that essentially service the financial sector, the idea is that if all of the financial organisations can essentially list the relevant third parties they work with, we can then identify those critical ones and have serious oversight over them and push them to have a certain level of security in place. Because if they were to go down and the availability of their services were, to disappear, then if they were a critical provider, the systemic risk across the sector would be huge. So as much as, yes, it is another regulation and it's a slight update on NIS2 and a few other kind of similar type standards and regulations, I think it's a positive step, and we'll have to wait and see how it's implemented and regulated.
Okay, off-piste rabbit hole here now, but the thing there is what you're identifying there as being a critical risk is, let's say, 3, I think it wasn't even half a dozen, 3 service providers. That
was just a random number, yeah.
Granted. But I mean, it's not too far off, I don't think. And what I find interesting now is that we've seen that there's a lot of consolidation in this whole idea of economy of scale, and then it's better to be bigger. And I'm beginning to think, no, it's not actually better to be bigger. I mean, it is from the point of view of kind of in a manufacturing context of, you can leverage economies of scale. But actually, if you're looking at economy, the idea that the UK has been a nation of shopkeepers is no longer true, I don't think. And the high street is in disrepair because economies of scale have pushed everything out to the business parks. And where there is a convenience element to that, is an interesting kind of downside, is that the high street suffers. And subsequently, I think with delivery of any service, there's that as well. And I think that would it be easier to hit one big player than 50,000 smaller players? But again, I don't know that.
No, I think it's a valid point. I think in the industry we see more from a security perspective rather than an IT service provider only. But we're seeing more organizations going to boutiques rather than the large players purely because they're going there for the specialist skills. And so arguably you may actually find, and again, we'll have to wait and see what happens, but I think you may find more smaller organizations than fewer larger mammoths. So again, I'm intrigued to see, you could have a very small organization being deemed to be critical in somewhat. So it could be very interesting. But again, the budgets behind some of these smaller players could be interesting.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. That's good. That's good to hear as well. Okay, so look, where are we now? Yes, notes. So one of the things that we ask for is for either viewers or customers to ask us questions. And one of the comments came back was deep fake, either voice or video. What they can do now is very clever. Not really a question, more of a statement. But I think what that led us to think about was, personally, I've seen this. Cloning my own voice from a marketing perspective. I didn't think the technology wasn't quite mature enough for it to be flawless, and it's certainly, you can tell if you know me. But nevertheless, it's still coming, and it's still very, very realistic for what it is.
Yep.
But then I've also seen others that have looked at doing like the whole AI video, and again, their representation isn't perfect, but it's pretty bloody good. And I think entrepreneurs are talking about, well, what about doing this kind of whole AI, generating myself, and then I can increase productivity and so on and so forth. So clearly it's a growing market, the scope is getting bigger, there's greater uptake, it's becoming more sophisticated. And so what might be some of the things that we ought to be wary of, and how can we protect against them within that context?
Yeah, I mean, good question. I think deep fakes, whether it's voice or kind of visual aspects, I think they're two things that are, as you said, gaining in traction. They're advancing extremely quickly, even though there are some technologies out there that are very good but not necessarily perfect yet. There are others that are a lot better. And if you have the right capability, for example, if I tried to create one at home right now because of the mess behind me, apologies everyone if you can see it, it wouldn't necessarily be that clear. Whereas if I had a green screen behind me and I did the exact same thing with the microphone set up, it would be very clear, very crisp. If I knew not to keep my hands up here and to keep my hands down here, again, the quality of the content is vast. We've seen specific scenarios, occasions where organizations have been attacked using deepfakes, where they thought they were on a Teams call with a room of individuals, not one, a room of individuals. So they can be extremely sophisticated when the money is put behind it, and it's not a commercial product, but actually something that's been developed specifically for an attack. And so I would say it's actually very much there, and it can happen. We've seen millions of money being transferred in specific attacks. I can't think of the exact case study. If I can, I'll let you know for the podcast next week. How do people protect against it? Again, we had a good conversation yesterday. There are some organizations looking at creating kind of deep fake detectors, which look at kind of analyzing footage to look for kind of blood supply, which again, the layman's person is not going to have on their basic computer when they're having a conversation. So again, these tools are probably looking for kind of organizations that are huge and have big money to be able to spend. I think the easiest techniques and ways to essentially circumvent this is processes. If someone sends you an email and you're like, that doesn't sound quite right, whether the language looks perfect or it seems quite right, almost like an MFA type thing, don't take the email as the truth, phone them up and, confirm it basically. If you're on a call with someone and someone says something to you and it maybe looks quite right, but it was something slightly unusual, maybe, confirm it by email or confirm it by another method, try and give the person a call. Similarly with the voice, try and again get something written. Sometimes if someone's been, attacked in a very sophisticated manner and there's social engineering involved, you may email them and the hacker unfortunately has access to that as well. So there's always a risk, what is the other method and does the actor have access to that? Exactly. And then it's a very sophisticated attack, and to some degree, there's only so much you can do. But at the moment, again, based on all the individuals I saw over the last 2 days at a conference, which was mainly kind of finance related, there's no real clear answer yet. So I think this is where the kind of people education side and the process comes in more so than anything at the moment, unfortunately.
Wow. Oh, scary times in a way. Same time, very well. I mean, this is the thing. The technology keeps advancing at a terrific rate. It's interesting having been in the industry since the the internet started to become popular. I remember early days we were selling an email program called Eudora, dial-up internet access, and Draytech routers. I noticed Draytech got a bit of a thumping the other day, but anyway, I was surprised to see they're still going, which is amazing. But anyway. But then that went to lease lines, and then this permanent connectivity, and then it was a case of like, well, you need a firewall because you're going to get hacked, and it's just from that point onwards, it's always been. I remember when people were walking into the office going, "I'm hit by such and such virus. I need the silver bullet," and it's kind of like there's every time somebody gives a solution, somebody else will figure out how to break that. Circumvent it, not to mention the fact that technology using Moore's law is rapidly kind of escalating up, and it's getting quicker, faster, easier, whatever. So there's this constant changing of parameters, which is I think why cybersecurity is going to become such a dominant force, because it's almost like, forgive me if I'm just rabbiting a little bit here, but if you look at how things have changed from an organizational perspective in terms of 15, 20 years ago, people would have been buying hardware, servers, infrastructure, rack mounted kit. Onto that kit, they would put licenses. They would have their Microsoft licenses for their Office, for Exchange, for file servers, and so on and so forth, and have all of this kind of infrastructure. Now it's all kind of shunted off into the cloud, so that's become incredibly easier. You don't need, that infrastructure engineer doesn't need to be quite as complicated as it was because the infrastructure is simply being removed. And then cybersecurity, though, is a moving goalpost because it's always changing.
Yeah, I think there's multiple different angles to that kind of question or comment statement. From a infrastructure perspective, there's different risks. Again, if you're purely consuming something on a SaaS model, so using Google Cloud or Microsoft Online, that kind of thing, then you're not having to worry about the infrastructure. As you said, there's nothing to worry about. There are ways, and a lot of organizations have the kind of infrastructure as a service where they have to manage more of that. So yes, it's not physical, but they're still having to kind of interact with it. So some kind of job roles haven't changed too much. It's more the kind of skill or the way that they're managing the infrastructure is different. But certainly to your second point about things changing and the cybersecurity industry being very reactive, it definitely is. And I think that's where the sector can leverage AI. So instead of again, not trying to go into too much technical detail, but in the past, if you were to have an antivirus software at its basic core, you're looking for something that is known. So you're looking for a pattern that's been seen somewhere, and you're saying, I'm seeing it again, I'm going to block it. And that's basically how antivirus worked. It's basically like playing a technological version of Snap, is the easiest way I'd explain it. Whereas if you're looking at more kind of technical solutions now, especially that are leveraging AI, it's more looking at kind of based on the individuals, based on where the attack's coming from, based on what they're trying to do, based on, a logical reason for what they're trying to do, based on things that we've seen in the past, and kind of bringing all of that context together, looking at kind of everything, threat intelligence that we've seen and information sharing from other organizations. The AI or the integration of AI into these different solutions should help us be able to respond to something that maybe hasn't happened yet. Again, not trying to talk about my organization too much, but they started using AI back in 2008. And when WannaCry happened in, I'm going to get it wrong, 2012 to 2014, it was sometime then, something that they had developed many years before, which actually wasn't AI, it was actually machine learning, but something they developed years before actually stopped WannaCry impacting any of the customers. So it shows that although it's reactive, if we can utilize this technology in a really positive way, even though it comes with a lot of negatives, if we can use it in a positive way, it can actually be really beneficial for the industry. So hopefully that's something that becomes very common across all vendors, and the industry becomes less chicken and egg, from our side being the reactive response, being able to respond and proactively counter things, hopefully.
No, and that's really interesting, because also you're also saying that it's a great example. And I don't think at an organisational, institutional level, then it's sitting there, it's being dealt with and worked with. But what's interesting now is the conversation I had last night was with some entrepreneurs, is that they're thinking about it from their perspective and how they can implement it. So it's almost like the concept has journeyed from an institutional level through to a individual level, if you like, and it's become far more commonplace. So which is it's a double-edged sword in some respects. So look, we've covered a ton of stuff, which is great. I'm just intrigued, what might be something that you would like to highlight that an owner or a decision maker should be looking out for, and how to protect against it?
What should people be looking out for? I mean, in reality, the two biggest threats that I see that haven't really changed, or the two biggest risks I would say that haven't really changed in the industry in the last 15 years that I've really been in it, are two. One is the insider threat. People are still integral, and there's still a big part to play, whether it's a small business, a large business. So I think educating individuals, starting with their personal security in their personal lives, educating them on how it can impact them, because it's more actionable in their heads. They understand the real impact to them rather than the business, especially if it's a large business. So making sure that education is there and grounded, making sure there's processes wrapped around to protect those individuals and make it easier for them, because you don't want to make it harder. And then secondly, as we mentioned briefly earlier, the supply chain. I think that's a big part. I'm not expecting a small organization of 10 people to be quizzing their IT service provider, but just ask kind of basic questions. How long have you been in the industry? Have you had any incidents where you've had to respond? How have you done that? Do you have contacts with the ICO to help us in the event of incidents? Just making sure that they sound like they've got the relevant certifications for the industry, ISO 27001, etc. And it's not a one-man band that's only just joined the industry, hasn't got any experience. You're not comfortable or confident that they have their own infrastructure managed securely, because I think that's a big risk. And again, if you're working with suppliers, say you have, if we take the Target breach, you have an air conditioning vendor that's kind of working with you. Again, I know if you're small, it's going to be hard to ask these questions, but try and understand a bit about how they're going to maintain your equipment, how often they're going to need access to your premises. Do they need to have access to your network? Do they need a laptop, etc., etc.? Just because the risks posed across those two areas are huge. And in reality, there isn't really as you said before, a silver bullet for either of them. We're still finding it very difficult to manage the insider threat, malicious or accidental. And supply chain, in reality, in 15 years, I don't think it's changed at all. I think people are still paper pushing assessments and not really doing anything to actually manage the risk properly.
I mean, again, we have already touched on it in other episodes, but I mean, that whole kind of everything is digital, the Internet of Things and operational, what is it, OT? I can't remember that.
Yeah,
anyway, thank you. All of that is it just blows you away, really, when you start unpicking that kind of bundle.
Yeah.
It's like, regardless of whether or not your car's electric or not, the mechanic, when you open it up, unless it's a good 20 years old, is going to sit there and plug a computer into it.
Yep.
To do a diagnostic, regardless of what make or model. I mean, it's not. I don't know whether or not you're actually going to get in a car and it'll start driving itself because somebody in a faraway land has hacked into it or not. I mean, that's a bit of a nightmare to think about.
It's very possible. A previous employer of mine was on BBC News, I'm thinking 6 years ago maybe, showing that a non-electric car that has essentially technical capabilities in it, because an infotainment system is electric. If you go back, I'm going to get this maybe slightly wrong, but maybe 10 years ago, the kind of infotainment system and the console that does all the kind of radio and things like that was on the same network as the main. So if you think about cruise control, emergency braking, all of that kind of stuff, the steering technology that keeps you in the lane, all of that was on the same system. So if you could hack into the infotainment system, you had complete control of the car to steer it, to brake it, to accelerate, to do whatever you wanted. Technology has evolved and these risks have been identified, and organizations are finding ways to remediate them. There are now standards, as you said, DORA for financial. There's also the same thing for the automotive sector. So now there's separate networks and they're trying to segregate them. So there are things that are happening. But again, as you said, chicken and egg, we're still fighting the cause, and there's going to be some interconnection that can be manipulated. Again, some organizations that are not luxury providers may be trying to find ways to cut corners, cut costs, which could invariably be releasing vulnerabilities. Who knows? There's some things, when you buy a car, you don't ask those questions. You're never going to. I don't expect anyone to. Maybe in 50 years' time, it will become something they have to show to their regulators. Who knows? I think there's a healthy amount of paranoia, but that one's maybe a step too far for some of the listeners.
But I mean, who knows? That's the bloody thing. You don't, I remember watching remember watching like Dr. No, I think it was, a James Bond movie, and he's sitting on a riverbank with the young lady, and then some noise goes off, and he pulls it up and he looks at this thing, and he's looking at essentially it's not how many, it's our headphones, but he's essentially looking at a beeper, right? So that would have been kind of futuristic science fiction, but actually was quite close to the truth, because that was 1964, something like that, and we had beepers, 1984. So 20 years on, and it's gone from being a kind of novelty in a film to being a reality. And I think we're seeing, those kind of things are progressing again. Reference Moore's law. We're gonna see those futuristic things more.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, if you go back to, and I can't remember which one it was, one of the Pierce Brosnan James Bond films where he was in the car park, remote controlling that car through the car park. Obviously, I've seen the behind the scenes. I know it wasn't done like that. But nowadays you've got as much as people may not like him, Elon Musk doing it with Tesla, and I saw another provider, I don't know if it was Mercedes or BMW, having the cars now driving through the factories as they're being built to get to the next stage of production. And Tesla also have released a feature, or whatever you want to call it, where you can stand in a car park, and if the car's parked somewhere, you can basically say, like, come to me, and the car will come out of the car park and come to wherever the key is. So this technology is advancing very quickly. Again, regulation is always a reactive response to it. So there's going to be, again, cat and mouse, chicken and egg. It's going to be a very interesting future. But I think, again, without the healthy paranoia, I think it's exciting. And stuff like that is something we should be looking forward to. But yeah, the risk that comes across with it is a different story.
That's awesome. Sorry, I just got slightly distracted there. The phone was buzzing. Nick, look, thank you. This has been great. And I think we're probably kind of hitting the 45-minute mark. Or thereabouts. So I've loved your insights and your candour and your point of view has been really, really good. So viewers, listeners, whatever, please don't forget, help us to help you. Click on the likey, click on the subscribey, and make a comment if you want. And if you're interested to ask a question, please do. If you want to be sitting where Nick's sitting right now, then please let us know. And again, thank you very much, my friend. It's been great.
No problem. I'll be here. Cool. Thanks very much.